Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for February 26th, 2021. I'm going to talk today, as it's Friday. I'm taking some questions, but the majority of the questions I got referred to an email that people received with an announcement from Helga LaRouche that she has issued a cease and desist letter to LaRouche PAC demanding that they cease and desist using Mr. LaRouche's name, as they have gone in a direction which I consider directly contrary to the central policies that my husband stood for. She said the content on the LaRouche PAC website misrepresents both my and Mr. LaRouche's positions, and she went on to say that it's confusing many who originally signed up with LaRouche PAC because they supported the ideas and the policies of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, if you received this email, I would urge you to read it. I'm going to make a few comments about it. But if there are more questions, feel free to write to us and ask for clarification. Now, why is this so important that we clarify this? Well, the global oligarchy, represented by the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum, and the people who support the Green New Deal and the Great Reset, consider the removal of President Trump as president created the room for them to move aggressively to bring in line this Great Reset and Green New Deal before the collapse of their system. Their system is collapsing financially, economically, politically. The Western countries are a mess politically. We see the infighting and polarization in the United States and Western Europe. We see the inability to take standard measures to protect the population, whether it's providing safe and reliable electrical systems, electricity as in Texas, whether it's public health as in dealing with the COVID pandemic. Excuse me, there's a breakdown all around. So the point is that LaRouche has consistently provided solutions, but these solutions are specific as to how they should be carried out. And most importantly was his identification of the alliance between four great powers as the key to defeating those people who are running the system into the ground and committed to wars, chaos, coups, and regime change, namely the British Empire. There is one enemy to mankind, and that's centered in the city of London, along with the global corporate cartels in finance, in big pharma, the networks of the media cartel, including social media and big tech, and the intelligence communities, especially in the United States and in the Five Eyes countries, which include Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. This is where the enemy of the United States, of the American system, operates. It operates globally. It's not just in the United States. And it's actually succeeded to some extent in the United States because of its control of the way people think through social media, through destruction of the education system, through the introduction of a moral relativism, which takes away from people the sense of what it means to have a nation committed to natural law. That's gone. Instead, we have people who develop opinions on everything, and smaller groupings, so-called identity politics. And as a result, the people have been confused, disoriented, and now, after the 2020 election, demoralized, because we see that we have a president who many people believe was not fairly elected. So what LaRouche proposed is you need to have a power greater than this empire. And it's not just the United States, it includes the United States, but also Russia and China and India. In particular, Russia and China are sovereign nation states, which act for the interests of their people first, but also with a commitment to working with other nations. When President Trump got elected, this is what he pledged to do. His decision to work with Putin and have a cooperative relationship with Putin was at the heart of why he was attacked by the British Empire, because this was a break with the Bush and Obama policies, a break with the endless war policies, a break with the use of false flags to send American troops around the world, and to spend our treasury in useless wars that did nothing for national security. And so President Trump met with Putin several times, desired to have a cooperative relationship with Putin. And the same thing with Xi Jinping. When Xi came to Mar-a-Lago and met with Trump in 2017, when the president went to China for meetings with Xi Jinping, when he negotiated the Phase 1 trade agreement, and when Putin and Xi worked with Trump and also President Moon of South Korea to negotiate a change in relations with North Korea, which was positive. This was the fulfillment, in a way, of LaRouche's idea that you bring together the four powers to take on the real problems. Now, what happened? Well, as I said, the enemy functions globally, and they targeted this with a global deployment. And this was to continue the wars, in spite of what the president tried to do. It was to have lying media and eventually censorship in the United States, and to polarize and divide the American people. So while Trump's strategy was to forge an alliance with Russia and China to take up the great problems of the day, this was sabotaged by Russiagate. It was sabotaged by the anti-China war hawks gathered around especially Pompeo and Esper, but before that, John Bolton. And over time, under enormous pressure, President Trump made concessions to them in terms of going along with the false flags against Syria, for example, the sanctions against Russia and China, Pompeo and the intelligence community pumping out lies against Russia, that Russia was paying bounties to Afghan Taliban to kill American soldiers, the whole Navalny affair, which is a complete phony, lies about China's policy toward the Uyghurs, which was produced, these lies were produced by the same network that produced the lies about Syria using chemical weapons against their population, or the so-called Skripal poisoning in Britain. So what we see is that this was a counterattack globally against President Trump and his policies. Now, it was the commitment of Lyndon LaRouche to fight this kind of counterattack, which he knew was coming, by an alliance with Russia and China. And that alliance would include working with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which offers an opportunity to end the division of the world into North and South, a developed North and an underdeveloped, poor, semi-colonial South. This is what the Chinese intended. This is what Franklin Roosevelt intended at the end of World War II, what John Kennedy wanted to do with his anti-colonial policies. But the United States, since Nixon, has been a force on a British leash, imposing the international policies of the International Monetary Fund, the underdevelopment policies, the population reduction policies, the policies which say that no country that is poor can afford a modern healthcare system, which is where new diseases come from. So LaRouche's policy was a global fight for the American system in collaboration with other sovereign nation states. And President Trump, in his UN address in September 2019, made clear that by national sovereignty, he meant that every nation has a right to its sovereign policy. Well, this was changed, and it was changed by Pompeo, changed by other people inside the administration, by the Democratic Party, by corrupt Republicans such as Marco Rubio and Cruz. Remember, Rubio and Cruz were the last ones who stayed in the race against Trump in 2016. They didn't want to see a change along the lines that President Trump did. And so what we've seen now is a reversal of that intention of President Trump. We don't know yet for sure which way Biden will go, but there are many people in the Biden administration who were in the Obama administration, which pursued these geopolitical provocations before President Trump came in. Now, I'd like to call your attention to a very interesting article that appeared yesterday by Aaron Mate, a very competent investigative journalist. It's titled, "In Final Days, Trump Gave Up on Forcing Release of Russiagate Files." And this is based on an interview by Kash Patel, who had been the top investigator of the House Intelligence Committee working with Representative Devin Nunes in producing the evidence of the FBI corruption using the Steele dossier to go to the FISA court to spy on the Trump campaign and the Trump administration. Patel is a very dedicated, hardworking, and reliable investigator who exposed the whole FBI crossfire hurricane operation, the use of the Steele dossier, and so on. Now, Patel in the interview raises the question. He said he doesn't know why Trump didn't force the release of documents, which would have exposed how the intelligence community continued to push an anti-Trump policy and at the same time an anti-Russian policy. Now, I've repeatedly emphasized to people who say, well, why is the LaRouche organization supporting China? It's not a question of supporting China. It's a question of looking at the world and seeing what potential common interests do we have with nations that could work with the United States to defeat the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, which are policies which would set up a global bankers' dictatorship to impose anti-production, anti-human economic policies that would reduce the population dramatically. The goal of the British Empire is population reduction by destroying the ability of sovereign nation states to defend their populations. And furthermore, to take away the power of elected governments, take away the power of the vote, and turn it over to technocrats who make policy on behalf of private interests. This goes against the primary conception of our U.S. Constitution, as stated in the preamble, which talks about the promotion of the general welfare over and above private interests. That's been the fight during LaRouche's whole political career coming out of World War II. That was the fight that Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche and the LaRouche organization represent today. And that was not represented by the recent reports and recent statements coming from LaRouche PAC, which is why Mrs. LaRouche issued a cease and desist letter. Now, what's needed today? A four-power agreement for a number of reasons. First, to make sure we avoid war by accident. If you continue to have overflights over Russian territory, Russian airspace, Russian sea territory, sea lanes, incursions into the South China Sea, extension of NATO eastward, and when we talk about eastward, we're not only talking about up to the border of Russia. Pompeo and others wanted NATO in the South China Sea. That's not exactly the North Atlantic, is it? So these provocations, and then typified by the Atlantic Council's longer telegram, which calls for a Cold War-style containment and encirclement of Russia and China. Statements coming from key officials in the U.S. military, from the military-industrial complex, from knuckleheads like Rubio and Cruz, who are pushing for confrontation against China. Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who basically said we need an economic warfare policy against China. Well, instead, what President Trump was fighting for was cooperation. And so how do you get that cooperation? You have an agreement on common principle between the sovereign nation states. Russia and China made clear at Davos that they are not supporters of the Great Reset or the Green New Deal. I know Xi Jinping and other Chinese talk about, well, we're committed to reducing the carbon footprint. But they're talking about committed to having other countries do that. What is China doing? China is going to reduce their carbon footprint by going with clean coal and nuclear. They intend to have 50% of their electricity production coming from clean coal and 50% from nuclear. That's not the Davos plan. That's not the Green New Deal. The Belt and Road Initiative is not part of the global reduction of infrastructure, which is part of Davos and the World Economic Forum. And so we in the United States And we in Western Europe should have a recognition of the common interests that we share with Russia and China and India for building a more human civilization based on economic development, based on taking power away from the global speculators who run the central banks and putting it back into the hands of elected governments. And that's going to take a coalition or an alliance or a cooperative agreement among the great powers in the world to reduce the power of the British Empire, which has continued to persist in its imperial plans going back to the middle of the 18th century. So that's the underlying issue in this whole question of the emergence of a new website, the LaRouche organization. So I would encourage you to, besides reading Mrs. LaRouche's announcement, to look at two things. Go back on the website of the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche organization to the February 13th roundtable on U.S.-Russian policy, where we had an extensive discussion of why Russiagate was a fraud and why it's necessary to pursue mutually beneficial relations. We're going to have a similar roundtable discussion tomorrow, February 27th, on China and the broader implications of what's happening with the financial collapse and the push toward expanded globalization, as opposed to relationships among sovereign nation states. So I urge you to think through these issues from a global strategic standpoint. What is the vulnerability of the enemies of the United States? We lost an opportunity by not having the full exposure of what happened with Russiagate. Enough is out there to know that it was a bunch of corrupt operatives of a corrupt cabal, including Comey, Brennan, Clapper, but also Obama and Susan Rice and Joe Biden as a participant, that this cabal did everything possible to sabotage the efforts of President Trump to form cooperative relationships that could defeat this empire. Well, we have to win this fight today. And I'd urge you to join the Schiller Institute, to join the LaRouche organization, to work with us to do that. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again next week.